Hi, I'm Lee Thornton from Middy Tackle, and I'm going to run through with you how I won 5 matches on the trot at Partridge Lakes this summer. So it's been a few seasons since I've decided to sort of spend a bit of time on a venue and fish a few opens, having chosen just to fish fewer matches over the last few years and concentrate on the big sort of qualifying matches. So yeah, the reason I wanted to give Partridge a bit of attention this year is because I feel as though since I was last giving this venue a lot of my time, it's sort of changed a little bit, and I always think, you know, if you can do well at Partridge, you can do well on many of the fisheries up and down in the country, just because of the how sort of like hard the fishing is, with how pressured the fish are. So yeah, I wanted to give the venue a bit of time this year and get a bit more consistent. So the first thing I noticed, having spent a bit more time on here, is that the old sort of methods that we used to employ for fishing for just purely F1s were a little bit inconsistent. They were still the best sort of methods to win the match, but when I'm fishing opens, I like to be able to get into the frame regularly. So I was looking at changing my approach to adjust to how the fish have sort of like grown up over the last few years. So what I noticed is there's a lot more older, wiser, bigger fish in these venues, and they're sort of mixing in around some of the newer stockies. So what's generally happening is, if you started to catch some stockies, you'd have some big fish come in your peg, and then that would disturb that shoal of fish. And then vice versa, where you've got lots of new fish in your peg, your bigger fish were a little bit sort of put off by them. So by attracting and feeding those smaller fish into your peg, you're sort of like, you're limiting how often you're going to get into the frame, because you're sort of creating scenarios in your peg where those runs of fish are going to get slowed down. So I just decided to tailor my approach to just fishing for to the older, wiser, bigger fish in the peg. You've got to sort of remember, these fish they've seen it all, they've done it all, they've been caught lots of times. So you have to sort of catch them on their terms. And by that I mean, in a 5-hour match on a venue such as Partridge, for a lot of the time, those fish aren't going to be feeding. So you have to sort of split your match into 2, if you like, in order to get the best out of your swim. So what I decided upon on here was that I was going to leave from the middle to the far bank purely for like single hook bait fishing, and there's 3 different ways which I'll run you through in which I've been doing the single hook bait fishing, and that is basically not feeding anything and either mugging, dobbing, slapping, and I'll go through those with the 3 separate rigs. And then for when the fish want to feed, I've been completely ignoring down the track. I don't think that's sort of like an optimal place to put a weight together in the warmer months. I've been fishing in the margins, and that's basically, I'm a firm believer that if you feed and make noise for fish before they're ready to start feeding, it's a surefire way to push them out of your peg and make them more nervous. I think it's less intrusive to your peg to catch them with single hook baits. It's the bait that pushes them out the peg. And then of course, once they're hungry, you can start introducing the bait and they'll come to it. But if you do that too early, it can be detrimental to the overall weight that you're going to catch out of your swim. So that's why I've split it into 2. All across in the first part of the match, that's not feeding, that's being very sort of stealthy. And then the second part of the match, that's when you'll start catching some fish. So the first thing I want to run you through is my bait choice. What I noticed quite quickly is, like I said, Partridge is a very sort of heavily fished venue, and everybody sort of fishes the same baits week in, week out. And I noticed that by fishing the more traditional micro pellets and ground baits in the edge, that the fish were coming in and they were feeding, but they weren't feeding hard enough to consistently catch. I just felt that I needed to have a bit of a change bait and move away to something that was a little bit different to what others were using, basically, just to try and give myself that edge and not be fishing the same match as everyone. So after experimentation, what I've ended up coming up with is fishing meat. And there's a couple of different sort of like ways in which I've been introducing the meat to the peg, and it's a mixture of meat mush, which is 6mm meat that's been again put through a mincer, and then 6mm meat. And generally speaking, what we're looking to do is put 1/3 mush to 2/3 6mm meat. So in anything less than 2 foot, we're going to be feeding just pure meat. So I've not done a huge amount of bait today because I'm not going to be using it, so this is just for demonstrative purposes. So yeah, if you've got like, say, a handful of meat, you're going to be wanting 2 handfuls of 6mm. And I'll mix this up now to show you how it sort of goes in the swim. So it doesn't go in dry like that, you end up wetting it up to make sure that it's nice and mushy and can form a ball. And what you're looking for is something that just holds together. Now when that goes into the cup, that'll be about right. The thing is, it's worth noting at this point that anything more than 2 foot, and 2 foot's on the limit, this starts to break up too quickly and has a too big a sort of surface area or footprint for me to feel like I'm effectively getting a bite. So it's just meat and meat mush in anything under 2 foot. And I've been introducing all my bait through a little cup and keeping everything as tight as possible. So as you can see there, that fits in nicely. So like I said, anything over sort of 2 foot, you're going to need to put some ground bait. And the ground bait I sort of selected and ended up on was the Scopex yellow from Adrenaline. Now the reason for the ground bait is that I'm mixing it very wet still, so it all holds together. But I want the ball of bait to hit the bottom and be over a tighter area as possible. I don't want a big area because it's going to take me longer to get a bite. I want a nice tight focus point on the bottom, and anything over 2 foot, you're going to need some ground bait with your meat to achieve that. So that's what I've been doing. So there you go, that's the finished article there. As you can see, it's very very but it will hold into a ball just long enough for that to hit the bottom, and anything over 2 foot and anything up to 4 foot. And that's the sort of spread of depths that I've been fishing in the edge, which I'll talk about later when I get onto the rigs. But yeah, that's the consistency you're after, is a very very wet ground bait, 30% mush, or 1/3 mush to 2/3 6mm meat. The next thing I'll talk about is my hook bait. So what I've ended up doing is, we're fishing meat on the hook, but as you can see, it's cut really thin. And the reason for this is I've been punching out really thin bits of meat. What I'm after is not having the heaviest hook bait in my peg. So what I mean is, if you've fed some mush, which is very very light, and you've fed some 6mm meat, the 6mm meat with a hook in it will end up being the heaviest hook bait in your peg, and I don't want that. I want my hook bait to be not the heaviest thing in my peg. I'm convinced that fish can leave the heavy baits behind. They're used to being hooked on them basically, so they always go for the lightweight stuff and leave anything heavy behind. So by having a really thin disc that's cut out, I can have a large hook bait with a large surface area, which allows a bigger surface area for the fish to suck the bait up, but also have it lighter than what it would be if it was in a cube. So that's the reason why I've gone for punch meat. So as I talked about, I've left the cross lines or the cross areas of the canal for single hook bait fishing. And I mentioned there's 3 different sort of ways in which I do this. The first one I'll run you through is the traditional sort of slapping, where you're making a bit of noise to any cruising fish. So for this, I found that pellets is still the #1 bait for doing this. And basically what I like to make sure that I do is have a different selection of colour. So I'm convinced that basically it's colour which is the main difference of whether a carp will snap at a hook bait or not. So by having lots of different colours, I can pick one on the day. And after a lot of deliberation and trial, I found at Partridge that a pinky sort of colour was best. Now I make these myself at home by mixing up a little bit of red Adrenaline dye with a little bit of white, and then making them sort of pink. But yeah, that's my secret for sort of slapping on here that by far the best hook bait for me this season has been a pink hook bait. The next way that we sort of catch is again by using the meat on the hook and using a very similar rig but shotted ever so slightly differently, and obviously without a hair rig, is to use the discs of meat on the hook. Now I normally set 2 rigs up for this, one with a longer line and one with a really short line. The reason for this is some days you'll be catching fish by the same fish that you'd be normally trying to slap a pellet at, but they're rejecting it and turning away. They can sometimes take a bait that's gently laid on top of them and flutter down, which is again where a disc of meat really helps with this, because it's enticing and quite sort of like smelly, so they can pick it up and snap at it. The other way, and it's generally on sort of like hotter, stiller, calmer days, is that you need a really short rig and you're going to be poking it in all the little sort of holes on the far bank where you can see a little bit of fish action. You might see a fish that comes up and mouth, you might see a reed twitch, you could see like a little shoal of F1s that are just sat in the sun, and that's when a rig like this would be absolutely perfect. So generally speaking, there's 3 ways in which I catch. There's the slapping, there's dropping at cruising fish, and then there's dobbing up and down the far bank tight into the sort of little rat holes, if that makes sense. So over the years at Partridge, I've been a great advocate of using the one-piece short F1 kits. So this year I've changed my approach slightly, and this is purely down to the stamp of the fish. So in some of the matches I've been catching, the fish have sort of been averaging £5, so some have been up to £7, and it's a much bigger stamp. So using a standard top kit has 2 benefits. One is that you've got a greater length of elastic, so you've got a greater buffer zone for when you hook a big fish, and you're less likely to get bottomed out. The next one is the tip. With having a longer top kit, you've got greater flex through that top kit, and you're far less likely to get any hook pulls or any hook length breakages when you're playing a fish out underneath your feet. So that's the reason why I've gone back to standard top kits. It's purely due to the size of the fish that I've been catching on the venue this year. The elastic choice for all the top kits has been the Cerise reactor core. It's like a 12 to 16 that it's rated, but it's actually slightly softer than that. But this sort of caters for everything that I'm likely to hook. It gets F1s in the net really quickly, but can also subdue those really big carp and have a lot of power lower down to stop myself getting broken up if they ever go on a big run, which they sometimes do down the middle here. Line choice, we've got 018 on all the rigs, on all the main line. I just choose 018 for all my main line for my commercial fishing these days. It's far more robust, it's stiffer, you get a slower drop through the water, everything about it is just right. So for my far bank fishing, I generally set up 3 rigs. 2 of them will be fishing with discs of meat on the hook, and one of them will have a hair rig for slapping the pellets. So it generally comprises of a 4x10 mudline float. These are very short, they've got a glass fibre stem and a 2mm bristle, so it just allows it to go in. The stem will always sink straight away due to the slightly increased weight of the glass, and it will be fishing and sitting straight away. And because we're fishing so shallow, sometimes we get down to depths of sort of 8 inches trying to sort of dob these fish. You need a really short, small float. You'll notice as well that I've got the shot a little bit further away on this one. I found by having, if you put all of the shot directly beneath the float with such a light hook bait, like a disc of meat, you end up missing more bites as there's a greater sort of loop in the line. You actually need that weight on this one, on a light hook bait, in order to not miss bites. And then hook lengths is either an 014 or an 016, and all of the hooks that I've been using has been throughout the year is a size 14 KM4, which again seems quite a big hook for this venue, but with having that light disc of meat, the hook weight gets lost in it and it doesn't really make a difference. And obviously when you're fishing with fish up to sort of £7 or £8 and you might only get 2 or 3 bites an hour, you want to make sure that everything you hook you're landing. You don't want to be having any hook pulls, you don't want to be having any of your line breaking. So these rigs are far more robust than what I'd usually be using over the past few years at this venue. So like I said, I set up 3 different rigs. 2 of them are exactly the same as this. One will have sort of generally 2 to 3 feet of line above the float. The next one will have, I would say, circa 4 to 6 inches above the float, because I'm literally going to be poking this into little holes in the reeds, etc. Just trying to dob those fish that are sat up in the water, basking in the sun early on in the session. The rig for slapping is almost identical to the rigs that are used for using the discs of meat across, although the only difference is the shot's directly beneath the float, and we've got a longer hook length, and we've got a KM3 with a hair. Again, it's 016, it's a size 14, 018 main line, and the reactor core Cerise. So like I said, the only difference is a hair and the shot beneath the float. Now the reason that you can get away with the shot beneath the float on this is because a pellet is a far heavier hook bait than the disc of meat, and the pellet itself will keep a nice tight line between your hook and your float, so you can see those bites quickly. But yeah, that's my rig for slapping. So then we start looking at the edge rigs. So for my edge fishing, I generally set up anywhere between 3 and 4 rigs, and that's to get a great sort of spread of depths up and down that slope. Finding the right depth is really important, and we'll go into that shortly. But again, all the floats are all the rigs are basically very similar. Again, we've got the yellow Cerise hollow core, we've got 018, and the float choice that I've gone for is the diamond shape, and we've got a 1.5mm hollow bristle and a glass sort of stem. Now what I'm after is I'm just after a nice stable float, and the reason for not going any more than sort of like 1.5 on the slightly deeper rigs is, again, that hook bait that I'm using is quite light, and I feel by having a thicker bristle in the depth of water of anything over sort of 2.5 feet, I'm not going to see the bite as positive as I'd like, and I'd end up striking at sort of either liners or bites that I shouldn't be going in at, basically. Now the next thing to talk about is where I've positioned my bulk. So all of the rigs that I've got for fishing down the edge have a bulk 5 inches from the hook. There's 2 reasons for this. One is, again, the light hook bait, and by having a more sort of negative shotting pattern, I'm going to struggle to see the positive bites. Now, I do think that I'd potentially get a few more bites if I was to spread the bulk around. But what I've discovered is the fish at Partridge feed very tentatively, and by having the bulk so close to the hook, it allows me to read my peg far quicker than what I would do with a negative shotting pattern. And when I say read my peg, what I'm looking to do is change my depth as soon as I start getting any missed bites. If you start getting missed bites that you're not connecting into, it's a surefire sign that you've got fish entering your peg above your bulk. And if you've got fish entering and trying to feed in your peg above your bulk, then that's a clue that you're fishing in the wrong depth, basically. So I feel as though I get more bites by having this positive shot, so I can read that situation far quicker, and then pick up a shallower rig and start fishing in shallower water. It takes a bit longer to read those signs with a more negative shotting pattern. So that's the reason why everything's a positive. It's to show up the bite on the light hook bait, it's to keep everything over my tight ball of bait, and it's to read my float to make sure that I'm picking up a shallower rig as quick as possible. Okay, so as I've discussed, one of the most important things down the edge is to have a spread of depths. So every sort of day is different, where a depth will be far more efficient to get a bite in than the day before, and it can even change during the course of a session. So that's why I generally will set up 3 or 4 rigs, and then on the day I'll work out which depth is best. And like I said, the way to work it out is if you're feeding and you're going in and you're getting no bites, then quite clearly you're in a depth that the fish aren't comfortable in feeding at. If you're going in and you're getting missed bites, which look like bites, but you're not connecting with fish, then you need to be coming up into shallower water. And by having the bulk down rigs, that just speeds up that process. You can read it far quicker. But don't be fooled into thinking that once you've found the correct depth, that's it for the rest of the session. That can change again, and you need to be constantly on the ball, making sure that you're making those adjustments during the course of the day. Now, the other thing that doesn't seem to get talked about as much as what I'd expect is the distance that you fish from yourself. So I picked this up quite quickly some years ago when I was doing my pace shallow fishing, that by having too many fish in your peg can be just as detrimental as having no fish in your peg. Because when fish come and feed in your swim, there's a lot of water movement, and if you've got too many there, your hook bait will be wafting around too much to get an effective bite. So once I've found the correct depth, I will also vary the distance that I'm fishing to and from myself during the course of the day, because you can have the correct depth, but at times for periods of the match you can be having too many fish coming to your swim, and a real quick way to fix that problem is to take a section off and come close, and then you can often find you can get a brilliant run of fish before it quietens off again, and then you back off to the original line. So yeah, that's probably been the secret to my margin fishing this year, is by fishing a slightly different bait to everybody else, but also being on the ball in switching depths and switching the distance away from me, just to keep those fish coming in and going into the net on a more regular basis. So 2 more things to sort of note that sort of help we get through on like fishing in this manner. Timing is key. Like I said, we're fishing for bigger fish, and you can't force those fish into feeding, but you need to be making sure that you're fishing for them at the right times. So quite often at Partridge, you can have a quick start in the edge and catch a few feeding fish, and that will quickly tail off. And the key is to make sure that you don't keep trying to keep catching fish that aren't feeding. That's when you ignore and stop feeding your margin line and go across and start sort of fishing for the fish with single hook baits. Like I said, slapping, mugging, dobbing, whatever it is on the day, it'll always be different, and it's down to you to figure out what's right. But you need to make sure as well that when those fish are feeding, that you're straight on it. So you need to keep an eye on the other anglers around you. You need to keep an eye on what the fish are doing in terms of their behaviour. Quite often you'll stop seeing cruising fish, or you'll see cruising fish start coming and drifting into the margins, etc. It's so key to make sure that you time your match right. And the other thing to remember is you're fishing for such big fish here. I think I've had 29 fish here go 156 £, which is a massive stamp for Partridge. So patience. You don't have to be catching many fish at all in the first sort of half of the match. On the matches that I've won with a lower weight, sort of like £100, if I'm catching 2 to 3 carp an hour for the first part of the match, I'm completely happy with that. Because like I said, you're only going to need 15 or 20 fish to get to your target weight, and you can catch some fish really quickly in that last hour. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this video. I've gone through all the sort of things that I've learned at my local fishery, Partridge, this summer. Some of these things you'll be able to take away and use at your fishery. And I just want to wish you good luck, and I hope you get plenty of fish in the net.